Anatomical terminology and membranes. To begin, we're going to look at some basic anatomical terminology. The first are the body cavities. The body cavities can be broken down into an anterior and a posterior cavity. The anterior cavity can then be broken down further. The anterior cavity is made up of the thoracic cavity, which has another cavity inside of it called the pleural cavity. Pleural refers to the lungs, so the pleural cavity is going to enclose the lungs. There would be a right and a left pleural cavity. Additionally, inside of the thoracic cavity, we have the pericardial cavity. Peri means around, cardium means the heart, so of course this cavity contains the heart. The other of the major cavities inside of the anterior cavity is the abdominal cavity. And of course, just inferior to the abdominal cavity is the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity is going to contain lots of digestive organs such as the small intestines, the stomach, the liver, and the pelvic cavity would contain some of the urinary system organs such as the urinary bladder, or in women, it would contain some of the female reproductive structures such as the uterus. The posterior cavity then is broken down into a couple cavities as well. The cranial cavity is the first of those. The major organ that you're going to find inside of the cranial cavity would be the brain, and then the vertebral cavity as well. The major organ that you'll find inside of the vertebral cavity is the spinal cord. Taking a look at the picture, you can see on the left that there is an anterior cavity. In this case, what you see is a thoracic cavity on top, separated by the diaphragm, the abdominal cavity below that, and then inferior to the abdominal cavity, you have the pelvic cavity. You can see those same cavities by looking at the anterior view on the right. You would have the right and left pleural cavities, and then the pericardial cavity between those. Those would be part of the thoracic cavity. That separated by the diaphragm to the abdominal cavity, and then inferior down in the pelvis, of course, is the pelvic cavity. Moving back to the left picture, you can see the dorsal or posterior cavities containing the cranial cavity where the brain would be housed, and the vertebral cavity where the spinal cord would be housed. Next, we're going to look at the planes of section. So if we were going to take a section of an organ or a body, which sections or planes could we cut on? The first plane is a mid-sagittal, or the first section is a mid-sagittal. A mid-sagittal section will give you a symmetrical right and left half when you are done cutting. A frontal section, as the name implies, will cut you into front and back halves. A transverse section, sometimes also called a cross section, will cut you into top and bottom halves. In this picture, you can see in green the mid-sagittal section or plane. The frontal plane is in blue, and the transverse plane is in pink. We're also going to look at what we call relative body positions. Relative because they are relative to another structure. So, the first thing that we need to do is talk about anatomical position. We're always going to use anatomical position as a reference point. In anatomical position, you are standing up. Your hands, your palms are facing forward, your feet are facing forward, and your head is facing forward. Therefore, if you're in anatomical position, you have two sides. You have an anterior side, which will be your front, and you have a posterior side, which of course will be your back. Structure anterior would be your face, your navel, for example. Structures on the posterior side of your body would be your buttocks, your vertebral column. Those are two examples. The next two positions that we're going to talk about would be proximal and distal. Proximal means that you're closer to the point of attachment in a limb. So usually when we use proximal and the next distal, pop that up there, we're going to use that when we're talking about arms and legs. Distal then is going to be further from the point of attachment in a limb. So for example, if you're standing in anatomical position, I would say that my elbow is proximal to my wrist, meaning that my elbow is closer to the point of attachment, which is my shoulder, than my wrist is. Conversely, my wrist would be distal to my elbow. It's further from the point of attachment in a limb. The easiest way to remember distal is to know that it's the distant structure. So you can see again in this picture that distal is the further structure, proximal is the near structure. The next two terms that we're going to use are superior and inferior. Superior, of course, is the top. Inferior is to the bottom. We will not use superior and inferior in our limbs. Rather, we'll use proximal and distal. However, if you want to in your trunk use superior and inferior, that would be fine. For example, my nose is superior to my mouth. Or, the flip side of that, my mouth is inferior to my nose. And the next thing that we're going to look at are tissue membranes. The first type of tissue membrane is a serous membrane. These are membranes that line body cavities. Serous membranes release a serous fluid. The idea here is that they would lubricate organs and such with a serous fluid so that lesions wouldn't occur because of friction. Another type of tissue membrane is a mucous membrane. Mucous membranes are going to line cavities that open up to the outside. So, for example, your mouth is a body cavity that opens up to the outside. Your nose is a body cavity that opens up to the outside. Your rectum is a body cavity that opens up to the outside. Those would all be mucous membranes. The cells that are releasing the mucus onto the mucous membranes are cells called goblet cells, named because they look like a goblet when looking at them under the microscope. Synovial membranes then are the last category of membranes. Synovial membranes are going to line synovial joints. Synovial joints are the freely moving joints inside of your body. They're going to release a synovial fluid. Again, the synovial fluid is going to be used for lubrication purposes. And the cutaneous membrane brings us into our first body system. The cutaneous membrane is our skin.